Okay, your next unit is Unit 2, Independence, Objectivity and Due Care. Let us see the overall syllabus grid. We are doing section 1. We have already done Unit 1, and this second Unit 2 will complete your section 1. It has 35% to 45% weightage of your CMA Part 1, and since the word itself is mandatory guidance, so it's very important section, and I believe that you need to read this section repeatedly, the text itself. That's why my slides are much more detailed, so that you get finer and deeper understandings of the concepts and the terms used. So let us see the subunits included in this chapter are: we have independence of the internal audit activity, we have objectivity of internal auditors, we have impairment to independence and objectivity, audit proficiency, internal audit resources, we have due professional care and continuing professional development, quality assurance, very important area, we'll see, reporting on quality assurance, and finally we have internal and external assessments. So the overall section 1, which is 35% to 45% of your part 1, it includes all the mandatory elements in definition of internal auditing, which we have done in detail in your part 1, the chapter 1. The code of ethics we studied in detail in your chapter 1, and then international standards on internal auditing, which simply are referred to as standards. Alright, so what we're going to study today is that how an internal auditor can maintain independence and objectivity, what the term independence and objectivity means. That's the agenda for today. Then we need to know the level of knowledge, the skills, the competency that must be available to the internal auditor himself and to the group as a whole. The whole internal audit department function or internal audit activity. What are the skills, knowledge and competencies needed? This is the third element. Then how do we exercise due professional care? What does the term due professional care mean? How can an internal auditor exercise due professional care? That we will study in detail. And then a very important area, the continuing professional development, CPD, or the continuing professional education. Almost every professional accountancy body like CA, ACCA, CIA, CMA, every accountancy body has this compulsory requirement that the qualified members should continue update their skills, knowledge and competency. So that's also an element of your standards, the mandatory guidance that the internal auditors must regularly continue to upgrade, enhance their professional knowledge, skill and competence. And then finally we will study about the quality assurance, because the internal audit department, yes, we know they work independently and they are objective in performing work, but who will assess the quality of the internal audit department itself? So that's the idea, that in order to have an independent check on internal auditors are themselves independent, right? But who will check the quality of the work done by these independent internal auditors? So therefore that we have an arrangement, the quality assurance system, internal and external assessments. So we will read about it at the end of your unit 2, very crucial. Alright, so let us first study something about independence and objectivity. This, I'm sure you remember, this is a part of your definition of internal auditing, that internal audit is an independent and objective consulting and assurance activity, right? So what does the term independence and objectivity means? Let us probe into much detail. It says internal audit department. When it says activity, it means department. Internal audit activity, internal audit function must be independent, must be free from any influence, must report directly to the board of directors or audit committee, and internal auditors must themselves be objective. So a very crucial distinction: the internal audit department must be independent, free from influence of any other department, and the internal auditors working in that department must be objective in performing their work. So we will dwell upon this in detail. The Institute of Internal Auditors has issued Attribute Standard 1100 and also an interpretation standard with the detail that list out the full detail of what the independence and objectivity means. I have broken down, you don't need to memorize, just need to learn the terms, the concepts. So I have broken down this whole standard into smaller lines so that you understand each and every concept. So the interpretation standard 1100, what it is all about, it defines what is independence, how it can be achieved. So independence is the freedom. Remember, the internal audit department must be independent and the internal auditor working in that department must be objective. So we are going to see in much more specific terms how the Institute of Internal Auditor explains independence and objectivity. So independence is in fact the freedom from conditions. Which conditions? It's freedom from conditions that threaten the ability of internal audit department. Such conditions that can threaten internal audit activities department, that will prevent the internal audit department to work in an unbiased manner. Like if the internal audit department, a crude example but it will clarify the concept, if the internal audit department is made to report to the CFO, then the internal audit department effectively is not an internal audit, and they are not independent. They do not have the organizational independence. Internal audit department does not report to CFO, but if it does in a company that has been made so, like in my first job as a manager internal audit, when I was interviewed, interestingly, I was interviewed by the CFO and he said, you will be reporting to me as a manager audit. I was surprised that this person maybe doesn't know the role of internal auditor. Internal audit department, internal auditor, they do not functionally report to the departmental heads like CFO or the chief investment officer or the chief administration officer. This is in fact totally in violation of the standards. Internal audit department must be independent from any organizational influence from any department, finance, marketing, research, sales, etc. So that is important, because if I have if the internal audit department is independent, only then they can effectively carry out their responsibility as the internal audit department. But if it's under the influence of finance department or marketing, then their independence is impaired. They cannot give independent opinions and judgments, and of course it will totally violate the standards of the internal auditing. Alright, so now let us clarify the concept. Internal audit department must be independent. Okay. Internal audit department must be free from any influence of any organizational status from other departments. There are two types of reporting that internal audit department is required to do. The first type of reporting is called the administrative reporting, relating to day-to-day affairs. The administrative reporting is done to the chief executive officer. Chief executive officer, like this figure here, it will explain the concept. If you just can look at this figure in detail. What is hidden behind is chief audit executive, where my pointer is, it's chief audit executive. Chief audit executive administratively report to the senior management means chief executive officer. Remember. So internal audit department basically has dual reporting responsibilities. Administratively report to the senior management. When you say senior management, doesn't mean CFO, it means chief executive officer or the president of operations. And chief audit executive functionally reports to the board and the audit committee. So be very clear about it. We have dual reporting relationship on day-to-day operations, how the finance is working, marketing, sales, inventory, cash management. This is reporting for the senior management or the chief executive officer. And for the functional reporting, the direction is direct to the board of directors or the audit committee. So the chief audit executive has direct and unrestricted access to the senior management for administrative reporting and for the functional reporting to the audit committee. We will deal in detail what these functional and administrative reporting include. So this can be achieved through a dual reporting relationship. So actually we have two reporting relationships, administrative and functional. We will dwell in detail what these are. So first of all, we'll have to see as the internal audit department, as internal auditors, we may face certain threats to our independence. Threat to independence means not being independent or being under influence of some department or of some person that you should not be. So threat to independence can occur at 4 different levels. Threat to independence means your department is not independent, can occur at 3 or 4 different levels. The first is that individual auditor himself may not be independent. He is under the effect of CFO. Like I was asked to report, it was funny. The CFO was interviewing me and he asked me that I will be reporting to him. In fact, the person to interview me should have been the board of directors or the chief executive officer. But maybe these people didn't know that the internal audit department is totally independent. So internal audit department, internal auditor must be independent, and we should have clear 2 dual responsibilities: administrative reporting to the president of operations or chief executive officer, and functional reporting to the audit committee. You have to be absolutely clear on that. So the threat of independence could be at individual auditor level. Individual auditor is not independent. Maybe he's under the influence of CFO. CFO asks for regular reporting. It means the auditor is not independent. The engagement, the specific work you are doing, that engagement is not independent. You are not able to perform that particular task or that particular assignment independently. So the internal auditor can feel threatened, his independence can be threatened. The individual assignment or the engagement can result in losing independence. The department itself, internal audit department, here is the internal auditor losing his independence. Here is the engagement, the specific work we do is in danger, in losing independence. And here we have the functional or the internal audit department itself is not independent. And finally, the internal audit department organization level is placed under the CFO or the chief administration officer. So organizationally, the internal audit department should be kept separate and with 2 and dual reporting relationships: administrative reporting to the chief executive officer directly, chief executive officer or the president of operations, and the functional reporting is to the audit committee or the board. So that's absolutely clear. So threats of independence could be at 4 levels: to the individual auditor, to the assignment or the engagement, to the department, and to the organizational level. So it must be managed at all 4 levels. So that's why we have come up with the dual reporting relationship, that the chief audit executive day-to-day operations goes to the president of operations or CEO. I'm repeatedly saying this, that you have to keep it in your heads. And then functional reporting to the board. So now we will dwell upon this, exactly what the functional reporting involves, what are the administrative reporting, in the next slides. So what we are actually studying is achieving independence through reporting to the board. So organizational independence of internal auditors at 4 levels. The internal auditor must be independent, the internal audit department must be independent, the organization level must be independent, and the engagement and the particular work you're doing must be independent and free from any threat. So organizational independence is effectively achieved when the chief audit executive reports functionally to the board and administratively to the president of operations or chief executive officer. So I would like to discuss then what are these functional reporting, because the functional and administrative reporting, we have to have clear bifurcations, clear lines drawn. What is functional reporting and what is administrative reporting? So examples of functional reporting, first is the internal audit charter. As we have discussed in chapter 1, that the head of internal audit department, chief audit executive, will draw up the internal audit charter. That internal audit charter would be approved by the board, that means audit committee, and the chief executive officer. So this is the first element. Next, every year we plan for conducting various engagements, or in other words, the annual audit plan. That annual audit plan, what we will cover, what we will check, this is approved by the board of directors or the audit committee. The second element is approving the risk-based internal audit plan. We need money to conduct the engagement. We may need air tickets. We may need cash to stay in hotels while we are on audit on on some foreign subsidiaries or foreign branches. So where this money would come from? So the internal audit budget and the resource plan, again, it is approved by the board of directors. Very crucial. The resource approval, the money for the conduct of audit, this comes from the audit committee or the board of directors. Clear? Chief executive officer or president of operation receive our administrative reporting, and the board of directors and the audit committee receives the functional reporting. These are the elements we are studying. The audit committee will receive communications or reports from us regarding our plans or the matters that are significant, and they must be reported to the audit committee directly. Like an incidence of significant fraud that involves a substantial amount and the senior management appears to be involved, chief executive officer. So clearly this is something that must be reported to the audit committee. So receiving communications from chief audit executive on the internal audit activities performance relative to plan and other matters that are significant must be reported to the audit committee and the board. And finally, very important, we must know that the internal audit department head, which you call a chief audit executive or the director in internal auditing, is a very powerful individual. He must not be appointed by the chief executive officer. Why? Because if chief executive officer appoints the head of internal audit, the internal audit department's head will not be independent. He will always be in a state of being threatened, because CEO appointed him, CEO can fire him. So the chief audit executive is appointed by the audit committee and the board. And again, removal is also made by the board or the audit committee. So it means the hiring and the firing of the chief audit executive, the remuneration and salary to be paid to the chief audit executive, it must be done by the board, by the audit committee. And so that makes sense, because we should not be under the influence of chief executive officer or the president of operations. Our appointment, our termination, our remuneration should come from the audit committee or the board. When I say board, means audit committee. Then the board can frequently request certain reports about the management, how the management is performing. So sometimes the board might require certain information about the management, certain fraud investigations. We do not have the mandate to conduct fraud investigation, but if mandated by the audit committee or enshrined by the internal audit charter, this could become a part of our role. But we are not investigators, we are not fraud experts, but if it could be included as a part of our work, if we are mandated by the audit committee and the charter, this could be a part of our work. So remember, the appointment and removal of the chief audit executive is with the board of directors. And then what would be the salary of the chief audit executive, is remuneration, total package, again would be decided by the board of directors. Very important, you need to remember. So all this comes under the functional reporting. And then making appropriate inquiries of management and the chief audit executive to determine whether there are inappropriate scope or resource limitation. Yes, if there are limitations imposed or there are some scope limitation that you are being prevented to do your work, then that's something that goes directly to the audit committee. Now the next is this dual relationship we have with the audit committee, the board and the chief executive officer. It could result in some sort of a situation that results in a tussle. I mean, like this rope in between these guys represents the internal audit department. Here is the chief executive officer and here is the audit committee. Both are individual powerful entities within the company. So this could result in a kind of conflict. How to manage that? So that is why it is very important that this conflict could be avoided if there is a well laid out internal audit charter that explicitly describes the purpose, authority, and responsibility. I'm sure you remember the internal audit charter document that delineates the purpose, authority, and responsibility of the internal audit departments. If it is laid out clearly, then this conflict between the senior management could be avoided. So the dual relationship this we have between the executive management, chief executive officer, and to the audit committee. So it must okay, wait a minute, I'll be back in a few minutes. Call. So we have dual reporting relationship with the board and the chief executive officer. So this conflict must be avoided. So the dual relationship that we have, it in a ways help as well, because we have clear line of authorities and responsibilities functionally to the board, administratively to the chief executive officer. So this dual relationship helps support from senior management, the board both, because board requests certain services from us, and the chief executive officer requests administrative reporting on different functions. So in fact, this helps the internal audit department in gaining cooperation from engagement clients, because if the chief executive officer requests certain engagements on operational nature regarding finance department, inventory, procurement, etc., so since it is mandated by the chief executive officer, so it will result in engagement clients cooperating with you. Then we will be able to work in a situation free from any interference. That's very crucial. So we drive our power from the board and the chief executive officer. Board provides us the power to perform our functional duties, and the chief executive officer for our administrative work. So we are really powerful in a company. So for chief audit executive, at a minimum, the chief audit executive need to report to an individual in the, so okay, in most of the companies, let us take it to a practical situation where we are working as a head of internal audit department, and there seems to be no audit committee, just chief executive officer. So where do we find then this dual responsibility? So if no audit committee exists, if there is board of directors, but they are all functional directors, there are no independent directors, what we would do in that case? So there must be an individual or a group of individuals, whatever designation given to them, the trustees or the one charged with governance. So at minimum, the chief audit executive needs to report to an individual or group of individuals with sufficient authority to promote independence. Somebody, whatever the name given, not always audit, because we do not find audit committee all the time, or the independent director. So there must be somebody, some individuals or group of individuals who can and who have the sufficient authority to promote independence and to ensure broad audit coverage. That's very crucial for us to perform our work, and that so as adequate consideration of engagement communications so that if we are working under the chief executive officer, there seems to be no one to whom we can functionally report, but at least there will be someone with some designation like board of trustees or the chairman of the board or someone responsible for governance, somebody responsible for governance with the sufficient authority to protect our independence and to ensure broad audit coverage. In that case, we will be able to perform our work as independent internal audit department, internal auditors. And that is very crucial. Like if we find out some weaknesses in internal control, some red flags, so there has to be somebody to whom we can report to. There are certain weaknesses found, so those weaknesses must be reported to someone charged with governance, and that person or group of persons, by whatever name called, audit committee or trustees or whatever, they are responsible to make sure that whatever recommendations we have made after our conduct of work, those recommendations are actually implemented. So that is very crucial. Otherwise, there is no use. We are just filling the files. We identify this, we identify that, blah, 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 blah. And we just keep the files aside. Somebody will have to take on the responsibility to make sure that what we have recommended, that it actually is implemented in the company. So normally in the bigger setups, we have audit committee. They foresee and they follow up what has happened. Are the recommendations that are made by the internal audit department have been implemented? So that is very crucial, that the recommendations of internal auditors are actually implemented, and those who are charged with the governance, it is their responsibility to ensure that the recommendations have actually been implemented. Further continuing, the functional reporting also includes certain elements. We'll discuss upon them in detail. Functional reporting to the board typically involves the board approving the internal audit overall charter, that what the purpose, responsibility and authority of the internal audit department is. We have already discussed in detail that the overall audit plan, the risk assessment, approval of this audit plan is rest with the board of directors and the audit committee. The board receives communication from us, we have already dealt with in detail. And if there are any private meetings to be, like if we want to report some incidents of fraud in which the chief executive officer seems to be involved or the senior management needs to be involved, then we have also the power to conduct private meetings without management present. And at the same time, we will also report to the audit committee and the board that our position as internal audit department is independent. If there is any issue of independence, that also has to be reported to the board and to the audit committee. Again, we've already agreed that the chief audit executive appointment, removal, compensation, it is set by the audit committee and the board. So approving all decisions regarding the performance evaluation of the chief audit executive, appointment of the chief audit executive, removal of the chief audit executive, it all rests with the senior management, the board of directors or the audit committee. All we have agreed upon. This has been previously discussed in the previous slides. And as we have agreed that any budgetary limitation, if you are short on money and you have to conduct engagements, so it's the responsibility of the board and the audit committee to remove any scope limitation or any monetary constraint or any budgetary limitation that might restrict the internal audit department to perform their responsibility. So this again, the relationship between the audit committee and the internal audit department and internal auditor department head. The next area is the administrative reporting. What it actually involves. So we have now got very clear understanding that we have dual responsibility. Functional reporting to the board and administrative reporting to the president of operations or the chief executive officer. So administrative reporting is basically reporting on day-to-day operations, how the departments are working, finance, marketing, procurement, etc., etc. So this all day-to-day operations of internal audit activity, internal audit department, that's what is reported to the chief audit executive. Now, what is administrative, including reports like budgeting and management accounting, the variance analysis, scrap reporting, operational audits, efficiency, economy, and effectiveness. You will study about that. So these are all day-to-day related. The internal audit department prepares administrative reporting for the chief executive officer or the president of operations. This is related to the operations of the business, day-to-day operations, budgets, management accounting, human resource administration, including personnel evaluation, compensation. All these are day-to-day. Then internal communication, information system flow, how the information system is working, IT, administration of internal audit department, etc. These are all day-to-day activities and they must be reported. And how good the policies and procedures working. Are they adequate? Are they working effectively? Are the internal controls working effectively? So this is in fact the area that is reportable to the chairman, to the chief executive officer or the president of operations. Chief audit executive, the head of internal auditor, as we have agreed, must communicate and interact directly with the board without management present. There are certain private meetings also in which the senior management is not involved, only the board members or the audit committee and the chief audit executive. So this standard clearly makes it understandable that the chief audit executive should have unrestricted, unhindered access to the board of directors. And if anybody restricts the chief audit executive's access to the board, that is clearly going against the internal audit charter. This could be regarded as a scope limitation and there could be some serious repercussions. Next is the chief audit executive's attendance and participation at these meetings in which we interact with the board. They actually provide us an opportunity to let the board know about how the business is developing. What are the level of risks faced by the business? What is the risk management process in place? About systems, procedures. So it is better to keep these meetings in a regular fashion so that the board could be given any issue arising at the earliest stage possible. The board must be apprised of any issues arising at earliest stage possible, because it is always easy to control a problem that is in the early stage. If it is reported late, then that report has no utility, no benefit for the audit committee. So any issue arises regarding systems like risk management, procedures, any issue with the business strategic formulation, that has to be reported to the board before it is too late. Because if the delayed report actually is no reporting. So that exactly what it tells here, to be apprised of strategic business and operational developments and to raise high level risk system procedures to control issues at an early stage before it is too late. So such meetings with the board also provide an opportunity to exchange information concerning internal audit activity plans and activities and to keep each other informed on any other matters of mutual interest. So such meetings must be regular, where chief audit executive can convey to the audit committee his concerns regarding systems, risks, procedures at the early stage. And such meetings also provide an opportunity for the chief audit executive to keep each other informed and other matters of mutual interest. So such communications and interactions also occur when the chief audit executive meets privately with the board at least annually. So chief audit executive must meet with the board at least annually privately without the senior management present. Why? Because the audit committee and the board have the oversight, the responsibility of the oversight, and chief audit executive, the internal audit department, helps the management to discharge its responsibility of oversight. So oversight means being not involved in the business, but still seeing what are things going around, how are things going around. So chief audit executive can play a very important role in this, that they can apprise the senior board members and the audit committee about what is happening in the company that needs to be reported privately to the board of directors without management being present. So that completes your 2.1 Independence and internal audit activity.